Welcome to the Trainers Forum, everybody. The monthly Trainers Forum is hosted and presented by HRD Specialized Canine Training. I am Paul Martin, your host, and tonight we are going to be joined by Kat Warren, Dr. Kat Warren,
or just Kat Warren,
who is a New York, or just Kat Warren, who is a New York Times best-selling author with her book, What the Dog Knows. The follow-up companion to that is What the Dog Knows, the Young Readers edition. And recently, as in just this past week or so, Kat has made all kinds of news with an article about the work that archaeologists and dogs, and specifically human remains detection dogs, are doing together on some archaeological sites across the world as a way to better preserve these sites and better preserve human remains from being unintentionally destroyed or impacted. Kat came to the world of dogs with her German Shepherd Solo, and she recounts that story of her introduction to cadaver dogs in the book What the Dog Knows, and she uses that as a vehicle to explore some of the science behind not just cadaver dogs, but she tries to explore the science behind all of the working dog, main working dog jobs out there when it comes to substance detection and people detection and so forth. So, with nothing else from me, I would like to say thank you for everybody that has joined us tonight, and thank you, Kat, for joining with us.
Thank you, Paul. And I'm so happy to be here. And what a week, what a month, what a year. I am really delighted. Paul, I'm going to click in this, and I know there's a little lag time. There we go. Whoops. Paul, let me start this from the current slide. Okay. I am controlling this machine, but there's a little lag time. So while, there we go. So I want to say a few things about this general, whoa, this is moving way too fast. Paul?
Yes.
Hold on. We're going to go back. There we go. Let me see if, Paul, could you, are you able to control it on your end? There we go. Okay.
I am.
Okay, let me see if I can do it from here, and I'm going to try not to touch it anymore. What I want to talk about tonight is some of the new material that's coming out with training dogs on much older historic and what we call prehistoric human remains. And I think that what makes the whole study of that interesting is what we can learn about the science, but also when archaeologists are working in tandem with uh, well-trained handlers and well-trained dogs, that the knowledge base of what we can know as cadaver dog handlers or trainers, how it can be expanded by this work. And it's true that there's work going on across the United States and across the world. And I didn't by any means try in the New York Times article to be comprehensive, because you can't tell all those stories. But what was important to me with the work was to say, where do we have really good evidence, not only of sort of good science and good information coming out, but also some of what we call ground truthing, because it's true that a lot of HRD work with historic human remains ends up not being fully confirmed. Paul, could you do me a favor? I'm going to
Yes,
try
ma'am.
to, I'm trying to do this from my site. Could you just flip it to the next slide, please? I think it'll be easier if you do it, because otherwise I'm going to screw it up. If you could just flip it to, thank you so much. So what we know about older human remains is that, as far as I can tell, and this is sort of going back in the history of who started what when, Bill Tolhurst was one of the first people who had kind of documented finds in Ontario, Canada. But this didn't make it into any scientific study or any journal, but there were sort of several news pieces at that time, and sort of knowing what everybody knew about Bill Tolhurst, and there's a picture, one of the earliest moments. Paul, have you in your work found anything much earlier than 1987?
I have not found anything really earlier than 1987. I will say a little snippet of Bill's work did make it into the book about the excavations there.
Great. Yes.
In Canada.
Good. Well, so what we see, and why don't we flip to the next slide, if you wouldn't mind, Paul. One of the things that we see with work on historic human remains or older human remains is that there's a lot of opportunity for abuse. And I know that probably most of you have heard about Sandy Anderson and the degree to which her work ended up being rife with fraud. And there is a moment where her work intersects with archaeology, and Archaeology Magazine did what can only be viewed as a just over the top for that magazine description of Eagle, her dog, and his remarkable nose. And at that time, he was the only dog in the world certified for such work. And as you dive into the article, and I think that we see this time after time in the media, we get Sandy Anderson walking across this field, and the dog's downing here and there, and Sandy's saying, he's found another body, he's found another body. And the problem, of course, was that that was pretty much the only confirmation, right? So that day, he found 55 graves and extended the bounds of the cemetery. And if you want to flip to the next slide, Paul, what's, I think, kind of remarkable about this is that Archaeology Magazine did this sort of story being amazed by the dog's ultra super amazing nose. And then, of course, just a few years later, they do a very small sort of online story saying, whoops, we kind of made a mistake here. And this now raises questions about the use of dogs in archaeology. And sadly, of course, by then, Sandy and her dog were searching for graves of victims in Panama and Bosnia. And so much work had to be redone because of what happened. But it's a kind of perfect example, because I think that there's a lot of temptation with historic human remains or older human remains to feel like it's that the stakes aren't high. If you want to flip to the next slide, Paul. So I love this little YouTube. Migaloo. So Migaloo's a dog who's in Australia, and this came out in the Herald Sun in Australia. But the fact was, it was in National Geographic. It was pretty much everywhere. So just a few years after Sandy Anderson, now we have another world unique dedicated archaeology dog, and beautifully his owner notes that he broke the previous oldest bone find by a trained cadaver detection dog, and so now he's got a new world record. And if you take some time and look at where the media coverage is going, right? Everywhere, and this is in mainstream magazines and major newspapers, is you have this sort of breathless, this is the first, this is the only. If you could flip to the next slide, Paul. And here's what happens. This came out in National Geographic July 2019. In 2017, National Geographic paid for an expedition to bring forensic dogs to look for Amelia Earhart's remains. And the dogs alerted in various spots, and apparently soil samples were taken. And the fact is that we've heard nothing since. So soil samples were taken in 2017, and there has not been any follow-up. There were hundreds of articles, perhaps not hundreds. There were dozens of articles about this particular expedition. And again, part of it gets to the point of where is the ground truthing here? And what does it mean to ground truth? Because much of the coverage essentially said these detection dogs alerted several places, and it was right on the edge of they've found her, and yet I don't think she's been found yet. So now, Paul, if we could talk about with the next slide. This is why it's so important to get really good peer-reviewed studies into the literature. And because there have been several actually great little studies. There's been several that have come out of the United States. I think Ben Alexander has done a couple great studies on soil testing and other subjects that were obviously actually cited in this piece right here. This is about a study that was done in Croatia, and Vedrana is the archaeologist, and Andrea Pintar is the cadaver dog handler and trainer. Some of you may even have met her or know about her. She and her husband also searched throughout the Balkans for victims of the conflicts in the Balkans and going back to World War II. And the dogs are really well trained on finding older remains. But Vedrana got a hold of Andrea and sort of had this question: is it possible that a dog can detect remains back to the Iron Age? So this is about 2,700 years ago. And literally they did a little test run with the dogs. Andrea and Chris brought two of their dogs out, and they were astonished that the dogs gave full alerts next to or almost on top of these sort of burial chests. So what these were sort of a pastoral people who year after year would come back to these areas where they had kind of beehive tombs, and within the tombs were these pretty small burial chests, but each burial chest had at least a child and an adult in it. One of them had 4 children in it. And Vedrana had already done excavation there. They had done some earlier testing, so they knew the age of some of these bone fragments. And what seemed to be left, sort of at the bottom of these burial chests, were bone fragments and a very little bit of soil. And Vedrana and Andrea and Chris had a beer together after they did this test run and sort of said, you know what, let's go away and think about this. And they did. They didn't talk to each other. And they started thinking through how they would set up a good controlled study. And that's what they did. They brought all 4 of Andrea's and Chris's dogs back in September of 2015, and then again the next September in 2016, so that there would be sort of no human scent that would be distracting or anything, or any sort of disturbance in that area. And the dogs were run blind and double blind spots where they helped find, I think, 5 new areas where Vedrana had not known there was a burial chest or tomb, and then one area where she had suspected it, and the dogs essentially confirmed it. What's sort of nice about this kind of work is that it was so carefully done. It was done the right time of day, and Paul and I are going to talk at the end of this about how important things like temperature, moisture, barometric pressure, time of day. This area has something called Bura winds, which are basically constant. And so it was so important to find these times when they could do this where there wasn't a huge wind, because this scent is very faint, and scent gets burnt off really quickly and easily, or blown off in the case of these winds that go across these mountain slopes. So if you could go to the next slide. What I think and that's a picture of that. It's a absolutely beautiful place to search, if you can imagine. That's the Adriatic Sea, and that's the other side of the coast, but you can actually see Italy from the top of this mountain. It's next to Zadar, which is a little town below, and this is Panda. All of Andrea's and Chris's dogs work very slowly, and they work almost like mine detection dogs would. And the degree to which their slowness and sort of methodical approach is absolutely necessary when they're looking for mass graves, because they're searching essentially farmers' fields, or where there were witnesses who saw bodies being buried with a backhoe generations before, and there can be not much to go on. So this kind of approach to training worked really beautifully up here, because the dogs were so comfortable with that kind of work. And I do love this quote from Ade Shun, because she is an amazing trainer and scientist. And she's developed, for instance, the mine detection programs for giant pouched rats of Africa. And she's done, the Netherlands is one place where things like scent matching, right? Where you've got scent from a suspect, and you've got scent at the scene of a crime, and you're trying to say this person's scent was left on this particular item that was at the scene of the crime. Being able to do that is enormously difficult. And they do it in the Netherlands. And they do it in a way that's double blind, and it is very rigorous, and it stands up in court. Here people have taken terrible advantage of juries' sort of culpability. No, not their culpability, the degree to which they're naive, and the tendency for juries to think that if a dog's nose was involved, that's rigor. So Ade Shun thought that this, when I talked with her, essentially thought this was an enormously controlled and well done study. But as she noted, every archaeological site's going to be different, right? And again, thinking about how can you replicate this? And they managed to do it in this study. And if you could go to the next slide, Paul. One of the things, as we're waiting for this slide to come up, is this issue of, with older human remains, very often if you're practicing with your dog and you're at a cemetery where you're defining the outer edges or whatever it is, that the issue is that very often ground truthing isn't going to be possible. And that's especially true when we're talking about Native American sites because of NAGPRA, which is the Grave Protection Act. The ability to take soil samples or that kind of thing is really limited. As you can see here, this is one of the little burial chests that that the dogs alerted on, that that Vajrayana hadn't known was there, and they found the skeletal remains of 4 children in this chest. And what was fascinating, and for anybody who has worked older burials, and I think perhaps many of you have, is that trying to figure out what happens with scent in soil and how it moves is really important. And Vegrana and Andre had looked at Ben Alexander's work, for instance, because we talk about a cadaver decomposition island, right? Because what's going to happen over years when you have, for instance, a clandestine grave is that depending on water, underground, and the kind of soil, that scent's going to move. And, you know, dogs, and I think Andrea said it very well, dogs are not body locating machines. They go to where the scent is strongest. What they felt in this case, and what Andrea was really impressed with, is that this is limestone, and you can kind of see how porous and cracked it is. And they were working on a very, very steep slope. But what was excellent in this case for them is that the scent did not go downhill. And Andrea theorized, and again, it's only a theory, but that when the body's decomposed, that liquid went right down into the porous rocks and cracks, and it sort of stayed there, right? As opposed to if it had been sandy soil, for instance, you know, a lot of that would have just flushed downhill. And knowing what will happen in cases like this is really important. And I can think, you know, when you look at Ben Alexander's work, and he talks about, for instance, how the dogs worked with clay soil versus sandy soil, and how this can be incredibly helpful, right? Paul has worked with Blair Torme, for instance, and with other geologists, knowing what kind of soil conditions you have and what kind of water table you have can make a huge difference. And to me, it's why it's actually fun to sit with some of this good science and study it, because I think it gives you a really nice glance into when you think about the difficulty of clandestine burials, right? Why there are all those challenges because of all the different conditions you're working on. Okay, so let's flip to the next couple, and then we can open it up pretty soon for discussion. So that's Lisa Higgins Dixie. I'm sure some of you will recognize her. Just a marvelous, marvelous dog. It's hard to believe that is she fully retired? Paul, do you know? Dixie?
Getting there.
Yeah, getting there. So
Dixie's
you can
getting.
Yeah, so you can just see this slight depression in Dixie's expression. And this is at the bottom of an older cemetery in the Midwest. And I think that the beauty of training dogs at locating older burials is that, for one thing, I think that it can really teach you a lot about your dog's body language, right? Because it's almost like when you start working on water, all of a sudden you have to learn a whole new set of, you know, where's the interest? How is the dog working? And I think it's why Lisa and others who, and Paul, who when they hold seminars, work on these cemeteries, is that I think the handlers learn a ton, right? I think the handlers learn even more than the dogs do of being able to study body language. But if you want to flip to the next one. I think that people can be a little too casual about it. And this is not everybody by any means, but the fact is that if you are training on an older cemetery, where an older African-American cemetery, for instance, and you're taking your dog there to train, the stakes are very high. They're different, but the fact is that I think that the rigor that needs to be brought to historic work is as great is what you bring to criminal cases. It's true that these are not criminal cases, right? The age is a kind of protection, but I do think that if you're going to train on older remains, and if you're going to train on cemeteries, learning to keep rigorous records, if you're going to do that, I think is important, because it can show law enforcement that your dog actually has some experience working on older buried remains, and being able to show that can be really important. And also, you know, I'm going to just say this: there's so much doggy woo out there. So, so I think that it's important to not add to it, right? When we're training on older remains or in older cemeteries, our ability to get full confirmation is usually slim. There are great opportunities when we have working with GPR in tandem with historical records, in tandem with, you know, experienced trainers, that it can be absolutely wonderful. And Paul will flip through the next two slides pretty quickly. I think I've talked about media coverage enough. I think that what happens though is that I think that when you're training on older remains, the sort of the ability to say yes to the media coming along, where you would never do that in a case that involved law enforcement, it can become sort of as mythical as we sometimes see with cases, with, for instance, Sandy Anderson, right? And so I think that I think it's important to think about that when you're taking these opportunities to train. And the upside of this is, Paul, if you could do the final slide.
Yeah, we're moving into peer-reviewed studies and those gaps.
So I think that the upside of some of the historic human remains work is that you can get some of this multidisciplinary sort of collaboration. And I think that's really important. And I think that Paul has said it, and so many people have said it, right? That the ideal with this is that you're working with GPR, you're working with geologists, sometimes you're working with LIDAR, which is kind of a marvelous new opportunity. And Paul, you might talk a little bit about that too. But I think that getting a chance to really dive into these studies and read them is great for both trainers and handlers. And Paul, where do you see most of the gaps? Well, there are a lot of gaps, but where do you see some of the biggest?
You know, for me, one of the things that I'm trying to tease out on some of this is when we're looking at a historic cemetery, why are the dogs responding to certain burials versus others? And with that, we can hypothesize that, well, there can be differences in just the sheer depth of the burial. With the use of ground penetrating radar, I'm able to begin to decipher, what are those differences in the depth of the burial. I'm also able to start looking at the what type of burial are present. Are are they in wood coffins? Are they in metal caskets? Are these potential shroud burials? So try and get an understanding of what's going on with the burial itself. Um, Speaking of the LiDAR, another avenue is looking at just potential temperature differences between burials. Um, Earlier
What do you
this
mean?
year, there was research that. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. What do you mean temperature differences?
Okay. So earlier this year, the there was research published indicating that dogs do have the ability um, to notice slight um, temperature differentials
Mm-hmm.
as part of their overall sensory perception. And
Yes.
with that, when we start looking at some of these burials, um, are there slight temperature variances? We already know there's going to be a variance there where the soil has been disturbed, because no matter how much time goes by, the soil that was disturbed for the grave shaft will never have the same compaction as the surrounding soil
Mm-hmm.
that wasn't disturbed. And with that, though, do we have slight variances in the temperature of some of these older graves um, that are that the dogs are potentially picking up on, and because these graves were created at different times of year, even different years. So it's really kind of teasing out those things. And then um, another, and with that brings into um, some of the other technologies, such as the LiDAR, as you mentioned, um, thermography, which is the
Can
study of
can
heat
you could
or
you
temperature,
can you explain explain LiDAR a little bit?
and LiDAR, which is basically using a laser and the reflection of that signal back um, to the camera is allowing us to get a higher detail of measurement than we've ever been able to do before. What's really nice about LiDAR, though, we can cut through all of the other vegetation. We can cut through the tree canopy. We can, and through the processing software that's available out there, we can remove that vegetation from the collected data and look strictly at the surface area. of uh, where a survey has been conducted.
Can it be used for
And
clandestine burials, Paul?
there is some research that has shown that it might potentially be useful in looking at areas for clandestine burials, specifically in noticing um, minute changes in soil compaction.
And LIDAR can pick that up.
Because LIDAR, there is a published study showing that LIDAR can pick that up. Another avenue is hyperspectral surveying, and with it, it's looking at the health of the vegetation. We use it a lot of times in agriculture already to help make sure that fields are getting the proper irrigation and making sure one part of the field isn't getting too much while another part of the field is getting too little. To the naked eye, we look out there and the entire field is green, but through the hyperspectral analysis, they can actually determine the health of the vegetation with this. And I know there's research that has been done with the hyperspectral cameras, and it's been able to show that even though the field grew back, everything looked to the naked eye nice and green, that no, in fact, buried beneath the area were research graves that had been created. So one of the things with the research, and that's what makes the research with the dogs and the older burials so much more difficult, in that we can't just go out and recreate a burial from 600 years old that has the same properties of a burial that is 600 years old in the lab. We cannot go set up an area on the side of an unused lot at the university and recreate a 500-year-old burial.
Yeah.
So that's why it's so hard to tease out some of these things. But it's also why when you do get the opportunities to train at sites like this, it does need to be done kind of in a precise fashion. And it does need to be handled a certain way, so you're not inadvertently training something in that shouldn't be there.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
It does. It does. And I think, are we at a point where we should take questions, Paul?
Yes, we can go ahead and open up. If you are here on Zoom, use the chat feature. I'm going to send everybody a message welcoming you here. And then if you are on Facebook in our live session there, just type it in there, and I will read it out for everyone to hear. So.
I'm sorry, there's a beautiful question from Lori Hall saying, what is doggy woo woo? Can I answer that question?
Yes.
It's just that thing where you make assumptions based on what your dog has done and how your dog has acted, and then you sort of just create a little myth around that mysterious spot in the woods, where there's a little depression and your dog shows interest, that just has to be somebody's old grave. And so it's that temptation that all of us have to create narratives around things. And I think it's especially tempting with older human remains, right, to just assume that if your dog is out there in the woods and showing extra interest in something that looks a little evocative, that you make up a little story about it. So because there is something so compelling, and I will say it because I do feel this way. I love history, and I love this combination of history and archaeology and dog work. And so I just made that shortly into Doggy Woo Woo. It's one of the things that we hear that we still have absolutely no scientific evidence for, is this notion, for instance, that vegetation pulls up cadaver decomposition scent and then exudes it through the leaves, right? So that we know that dogs are drawn to vegetation near old burials. We don't know exactly why that happens, but I have heard plenty of handlers talk about the tree pulling up the scent and telling the story through the leaves, which actually, I mean, it's a beautiful vision. I just think we don't have evidence yet.
We don't have enough evidence yet. There is limited research saying so trees participate in the whole concept of bioremediation. And that's removing contaminants out of the environment and either storing them or releasing them back out to the environment. We do know that there are some plants, some trees that do a better job at that than others. But as far as being able to specifically hammer down that this is occurring with human decomposition, we haven't been able to do that.
Yeah. So in the meantime, yeah, and Kimberly just noted that plant odor transfer. And I think we could go on actually a long time about plant odor transfer. But we've also got a bunch of other questions, don't we? And I think this is a really nice. Go ahead.
Yeah. One of the questions was, what has been the best part or outcome from writing your book?
there's been a lot of wonderful outcomes. Kimberly, that's such an interesting question, and I could take a long time answering. I wish I may not be able to train another cadaver dog that I will deploy. I think that what has happened though is that the book itself has opened up my world more, and there's so many questions you end up thinking about in doing this combination of science and history, and then sort of the dog handling. And so I think the best outcome is that it feels the world feels a little more dimensional now. And I've met so many wonderful people with whom I'm still in touch. Paul being one of them, but I mean, just, who have become just, I know, lifelong friends. And I think that, would that have happened going to seminars? Yeah, that happens to a degree, but there's been something really wonderful about knowing these stories and people's stories at an even deeper level. So it's the people. It's getting to know the people.
I'll kind of take this next question.
Yeah.
On using any type of rods to make holes in the ground when searching for potential burials. Typically, we start off with no type of added disturbance or anything like that to an area. From there, you can't, one of the approaches that can be done from an archaeological perspective is look at the soil density of an area, and with that you can use a probe, and it's actually more of a search technique for trying to isolate the disturbed area versus strictly to assist the dogs. If we're doing it to assist the dogs, what we're hoping for is a gas exchange of some type that would allow the odor to become available for the dog. Another thing that I've worked some with is actually putting in wooden stakes over an area. And I think part of what it helps to do is it allows the dog more of a focal point of understanding where potentially that gas exchange could occur. But so it ranges from, it depends, and it also ranges, it depends on how it gets used, if that makes sense. Next question. If you have a general location of 100-year-old burial of twin babies who passed from natural causes, you run your dog, he focuses on one specific area. Would you have someone else run their dog before rerunning yours? The only documentation is a family Bible and family stories passed down. I think he was on something, but there was also an old turtle shell there. Distractions don't normally throw him. The terrain had great potential to shift over the years.
So
what you say on that?
What I say on that? Well, I'd say that it depends on why you want the location. I mean, why is it important to find this particular spot? Would you run another dog and see if another dog showed interest? Absolutely. It's the kind of thing where you have an opportunity to let some time pass between running dogs, right? Um, and one of the things that can happen, obviously, is that if you it's really easy to encourage dogs into alerts in areas like these. I think that Paul will agree that if you have an area you're focusing on, um, uh, and the scent is faint, it can be, I think, a real challenge. Paul, what would you add to that?
You know, for me, when I read that, if this are we working the area as a training, or are we working the area as part of the survey process? And if it's the survey process, you go ahead and you mark that area, and under different conditions, you let another dog run it. Yeah. And if that dog, says yes in the same area, then we bring in other technology to try to confirm or refute.
If you can do that. Elsa Joy's saying that there will be months between the visits, too.
Yeah. So if it's training, I'm not going to pay the dog on it. I'm going to let the other dog run and see what happens. And with something like this, I do want to set a positive up over to the side, so that we can give the dog a good thing.
Yeah.
And this is kind of getting into where we're actually going in next month's webinar series. So let's jump over here to Facebook. I think we've got a couple of questions there, and then we'll come back to the Zoom questions. What type of demand out there for detection of older human remains, and what avenues would a handler or potential handler follow to determine if this is a field for them to work or train towards?
So Paul can answer that to probably a greater degree. The demand out there is pretty great, I would say. I have been contacted, I think, probably 10 or 12 times since the book came out, from different kinds of people, all wanting dogs that might be able to find historic human remains. And it has gone from, for instance, an executive who has a huge property down eastern North Carolina, and there was word that there was a slave cemetery on a part of this portion of this property, and he wanted to be able to get dogs out so that they could maybe make a determination where it was, so that they could actually maintain it and market, and sort of acknowledge that it was there. I also got a call from a contractor where he was planning to bulldoze, and he had heard through several sort of word of mouth that that there was an unmarked slave cemetery where he was planning to build houses. And he could have easily just gone ahead and bulldozed, but he actually said, I don't want to do it if we can't kind of rule out or rule in. We rule in, we'll avoid that area for building, right? So it's a I think a marvelous reason to have a dog trained on older human remains and have access to GPR and that kind of thing. I would say none of this is going to make anybody any money. And I think that you end up in all of these situations, you end up mostly being a volunteer. So, Paul, do you have anything to add to that? I mean, I think that I've been very moved by people who have contacted me, and in most cases, I've been able to connect them up to people who had dogs that had some training on this. Paul, what are your thoughts?
I think we're just beginning to scratch the surface with this. And the reason why I say that is just take the technology for ground penetrating radar. That technology's been around for about 100 years now. It really didn't start becoming more commonplace as part of the archaeological survey process until they started doing more with it in the 70s, and then as the technology became a little bit more readily available in the 80s, and now 40 years later, it's commonplace that we do geophysics pretty much on every site prior to breaking the surface of that site for construction or for archaeological excavations. Now, yes, we can look and see on construction projects routinely that are getting delayed because they've encountered human remains or they've encountered something they didn't expect. And for every day that project is shut down to deal with that, well, that's money. And so with it, we are seeing more projects begin to include the dogs as part of the survey process. Yep. Before building projects get expanded, before roads get widened, before bridges get built. And so,
yep,
over the next decade, I see this as potentially growing with more interest from the archaeological community. It's not something that's going to occur overnight by any means.
No. And partly money. I mean, all of this ends up costing, as you said, Paul.
Yes, all of this begins costing. It cost somebody. It either either we can do it through research grants, pay for it ourselves, so with that, it's a growing avenue, but I wouldn't say, hey, this is the newest, hottest career out there by any means.
No,
You
no.
do have some organizations like History Flight, um, that I've had the privilege to work with, and they've worked with um, a couple other handlers in the past, and they've used the dogs as a way to help locate the remains of American service members from World War II, um, and give a starting point for the excavations on the sites when they go out there.
Yeah. So
Um,
that's the kind of work that
because,
Andrea Pintar is doing.
yeah, um, like my work in Germany last year was really focused on, okay, we've got a countryside of 40 plus acres here. Where do we start? We've got 10 acres here. Where do we start? We can only be in the field for 45 days. So yeah, a lot of that, it's that type stuff. It's not going to be um, a lot, but it's coming. It's being developed. As we
Okay.
get more literature around this, the easier it's going to be.
Yeah, I agree. Um, there's a couple questions that I can see on the Zoom chat that can be answered fairly quickly. Should I do that, Paul?
Yes.
Okay, so Emma Thompson was talking about differences like of barometric, et cetera, and how that can make a difference. And Paul is the expert on that, Emma, but I actually do talk about it in the chapter that I do on older remains, because it's research and just literally people who do this a lot end up figuring out and being familiar where they've trained their dogs of all of a sudden scents burnt off in the morning and there's just no more scent for the dogs to capture. And this relates to Patrick's question about sandy soil and what's the sandy soil effect, and Ben Alexander's study on soil and the difference between clay and sandy soil, and dog alerts was really interesting, because it looks like, I mean, clay makes a clay makes a pretty nice cap on top of scent. So that particular study looked at the fact that when there were buried remains in sandy soil, the dogs were holding their heads much higher. In other words, it was like the scent was rising or more available at more of a height, whereas the dogs, when they were working on clay soil, had their noses right next to the ground. And I will say that it's also a question of training, right? Andrea Pintar's dogs, and you can see them if you go to her website. Just look up her name, and you can watch them in a field, and they've really got their noses pretty much pinned close to the ground, and they're moving slowly with their noses just a few inches from the ground. I think you saw that picture of Panda on the rocks. Very little head throwing, because the scent is so faint. So yeah, so there is a lot of information about barometric pressure. Paul, I think that you think that it's better if it's dropping rather than rising, correct?
Correct.
And
The So with basically pressure, the barometric pressure, the higher the pressure is, basically means the air is heavier. And if the air is heavier, everything that's being impacted by it is being forced down lower. And this can force compounds back into the soil. Whereas if it's falling, what's happening is air is actually getting lighter, and therefore things that are in the soil are able to rise. The gas that's in the soil is able to rise, and the dogs are able to detect it easier.
Yeah, and I think, some of the obvious stuff, Emma and Patrick, some of the obvious stuff is like we know what kind of time of day it can be better to work your dog, especially here in the South. And but I think that working one full day with Paul on this sort of Revolutionary War era grave site, possible grave site, probable grave site, is that it was really interesting that there was a sweet spot where things warmed up a bit, but not too much, where the dogs had been run just like an hour before and hadn't found scent, and an hour later, there was scent available. And so I think that somebody talked about how it's hard to find places. Here in the South, we have no problem finding places to train. I'm sad to say, we've got cemeteries almost everywhere, marked and unmarked. So I think that you will find, with just a little bit of research, that in your area, there are probably more places to train than you could possibly imagine. Wouldn't you say that's true, Paul?
Yes, and that's uh, part of why as we have urban sprawl, we are rediscovering a lot of these places that were abandoned to time and memories. And so with that, yeah, we have a plethora of cemeteries out there. And just like where I live, I'm probably within a stone's throw of 5 cemeteries that the average person does not even know is around here.
Yeah. So
And
Suzanne has an interesting question, and I think it relates to the cemeteries. Is that, do you train historical human remains dogs only on bones, or the full range of human decomp? And I think the answer is pretty interesting and a little bit unknown, Suzanne, but the fact is that there may be more decomposition and volatiles available in the soil than there are in older bone. And I think that we talk about a dog, for instance, detecting a toe bone that's 3 feet down. What's not known is whether there was something in the soil around that, because there was a body probably at some point that decomposed there, whether the dog is detecting the bone or whether the dog is detecting the volatiles that still may remain in the soil. Would you say that's generally right? What do you think, Paul?
I think that's very true. I guess one of the approaches that um, when I first started trying to answer some of these questions in 2003 with the help of Lisa Higgins and John Sullivan and some other people, we really um, started looking at what do we know about is being present or not present. What do we know as far as the dogs being able to say, this is human? And because we don't fully understand what that decomposition process uh, leaves behind and allows, and the dog uses to say, this is human. Um, our approach has been to take that full spectrum, freshest to fresh, oldest to old, everything in between, from the smallest to the lightest. And yes, we can hone in on some of the older bone and things like that, but it should not be the only thing we're training on.
Yeah, and just to add to that, Suzanne, because I think this is a fascinating conversation. I mean, I talked with Andrea Pintar and with Vedrana at some length um, because the fact is that on several of the sort of burial chests, um, the burial chests were fully excavated. And Vedrana had everything was taken out down to rock, and the dogs were still absolutely as interested in that rock, and part of the question is that there were no bone fragments where those dogs were alerting. There was nothing there except stone with cracks in it where stuff probably seeped down, right? So this is part of the answer. And what as Paul said, it's sort of like, I think that bones in isolation are probably maybe the least interesting things to dogs. Andrea took some of the bone fragments with Vedrana's permission, and it wasn't until she misted them with a little bit of water and let that water get into them that the dogs even noticed them, right? Or right, it made the bones so much more sort of tangible to the dogs, putting that humidity in them. And we can't know. I mean, we just don't know. We do know that there's very, very little organic anything left in these really old bones. I think we can agree to that, right, Paul? That it's
That
a lot of mineral and not too much volatile organic coming off very old bone.
but also one of the things that um, I've kind of changed part of my tune with over the years, it's not so much age as it is preservation. I can show you remains that have been out in the sun on the surface for just a couple of years old, and that are just a couple of years old, and they can be in worse condition uh, um, and less preserved than a bone that has been buried here in the Mississippi Delta for the last 1,000 years.
Mm.
And that's because we've got other factors besides just the passage of time. We have the weathering the demineralization that's occurring with the water um, that the bones being exposed to. But the sheer effects of the sun itself um, can break down and deteriorate these bones. So it's not simply a question of age, it's more of a question of preservation.
Yeah, and
So,
I think
um,
anybody who's worked bone scatter cases where the bones have been sort of out in the woods for a while and are disarticulated, I think you know how close you need to be to them, or the dog needs to be to them, right? Um, for them to be salient.
right. Um, so, um, we're going to take a couple of final questions. Um, yes, always ask permission if, to train at places and things like that. Um, as far as literature, um, I'm also reflecting back to a question about temperatures and times of day and so forth. Um, One of the things I would direct your attention to would be a poster that I did for the Society for American Archaeology in 2012. You can find that on ResearchGate. Um, and then I'll work on putting together a nice comprehensive list of literature, um, so forth. Um,
Yeah, and I'll send those links to, for instance, to the Croatia study, and also to uh, the Ben Alexander work on soil conditions, because I think those are interesting to look at.
Once we wrap up the session, I'll actually post those links on the forum uh, page there on Facebook. And then once this goes live on YouTube, I will include those links in the write up, the little description of all of this. Would love to come to Australia. Um, that has been a topic of discussion for a couple of years now. Um,
And
over
Patrick, raining lightly or misting out. I think misting is better than raining lightly. Paul, more than raining lightly, and it's probably a disadvantage. But if it's raining lightly, that means that your barometric pressure is falling. So there is again that little sweet spot between too little and too much.
um, one of the things that we saw here, um, working in the Mississippi Delta, and when I reference the Mississippi Delta, um, I'm not actually speaking of the coastal delta where the Mississippi drops into the Gulf of Mexico. I'm speaking of the swath of land that, um, as believe it was Mark Cohen said, it begins at the footsteps of the Peabody Hotel in Memphis and extends southernly to Catfish Row in Vicksburg. So it's the kind of northwestern portion of Mississippi. And one of the things that we found there was that too much moisture, the dogs would just kind of look at you like, okay, it's here in the area. But if we let that soil actually dry out for a little while and we have the process of evaporation beginning to occur, um, the dogs were then able to pinpoint down to say, no, I like this area specifically, and it's not this whole 20 by 20 foot area. It's much closer to, you know, that 1 foot by 1 foot that says, no, this is it. This is where you need to be looking.
Interesting.
So, with that said, we've been going for about an hour and a half, and I know we didn't get to everybody's questions or comments and so forth, and we could probably be here for another hour. I do want to thank you again, Kat, for joining us tonight. I thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Next month, we're going to have Jen, who is a retired U.S. Army Master Sergeant that worked dogs in the Army, trained dogs in the Army. She will be joining us on June 28th, which is a Thursday, I believe. It might be a Sunday. I haven't looked that far ahead. I'm still trying to catch up from the last 2 weeks. So
it's a Sunday.
So again, thank you all. This will be coming out on the YouTube channel shortly, and it'll have all those great links. It is available there on the Facebook page for the Trainers Forum. This also ties into this month's month-long webinar, which is devoted strictly to cold cases and historical searches and training and preparing for them. So,
nice.
Thank
you for having me.
Thank you, Kat.
It was a pleasure.
And thank you all for joining us.
Everybody stay safe out there.
Yes, as somebody told me the other day, don't go around licking things right now. It's not good for your health.
Oh, shoot. Okay. Thanks, Michelle and Paul.